The black limousine pulled up slowly in front of the magnificent gates of Buckingham Palace. George Clooney sat in the back seat, adjusting his black bow tie and looking out at the impressive building that had housed British royalty for centuries. The late afternoon sun cast a golden glow over the palace walls, making the entire scene look like something from a fairy tale. George had been to many fancy events in his life, but there was something special about being invited to a royal charity gala. This was not just any ordinary Hollywood party. This was an event where movie stars mixed with princes and princesses, all for a good cause. The driver opened the door, and George stepped out onto the red carpet that had been rolled out for the special guests. Camera flashes began going off immediately, as photographers captured every moment of his arrival. George waved and smiled at the crowd of fans who had gathered behind the barriers, hoping to catch a glimpse of their favorite celebrities. He looked perfect in his custom-made tuxedo with his silver hair styled just right, and his famous smile that had charmed audiences around the world for decades. As George walked through the palace gates, he could not help but be amazed by the grandeur of everything around him. The palace courtyard was enormous, with perfectly manicured gardens and fountains that sparkled in the evening light. Palace staff in their formal uniforms guided guests toward the main entrance where more photographers and reporters were waiting. George had visited many impressive places during his career, but Buckingham Palace was truly something special. The history and tradition that surrounded this place made him feel both honored and slightly nervous. The main entrance to the palace was even more breathtaking than George had imagined. Massive columns supported the ornate ceiling, and crystal chandeliers hung like diamonds from above, casting rainbow patterns on the marble floors. Other celebrities and dignitaries were already arriving, and George recognized several famous faces from movies, television, and politics. Everyone was dressed in their finest clothes, and the atmosphere was both elegant and exciting. Palace guards in their traditional red uniforms and tall black hats stood at attention throughout the entrance hall. George had seen these guards in movies and on television, but seeing them in person was quite different. They stood perfectly still, like statues, with their rifles held at their sides and their eyes staring straight ahead. George had heard countless stories about tourists trying to make these guards laugh or move, but they were famous for their incredible discipline and training. As George made his way deeper into the palace, he passed through several magnificent rooms, each more impressive than the last. The walls were covered with portraits of kings and queens from centuries past, and the furniture looked like it belonged in a museum. Crystal glasses clinked softly as waiters served champagne and appetizers to the arriving guests. The sound of polite conversation and gentle laughter filled the air, creating a warm and welcoming atmosphere. Despite the formal setting, George stopped to admire a particularly beautiful painting when he noticed one of the royal guards stationed nearby. This guard looked much younger than the others George had seen. He appeared to be in his mid-20s, with a clean-shaven face and bright eyes that seemed alert and intelligent, despite his rigid posture. The guard stood next to a marble pillar near the entrance to the main ballroom, where the charity gala would soon begin. Something about this young guard caught George's attention. Maybe it was the way the light hit his face, or the slight tension in his jaw that suggested he was working hard to maintain his composure. George had always been good at reading people, and he sensed that this particular guard might be newer to the job than some of the others. There was something almost vulnerable about his determination to do everything perfectly. The mischievous side of George's personality began to stir as he watched the guard. George had always been known among his friends and colleagues as someone who loved to play pranks and make people laugh. His sense of humor had gotten him in trouble more than once, but it had also made him one of the most beloved actors in Hollywood. He looked around the room and noticed that most of the other guests were busy with their own conversations and activities. George decided to move closer to the young guard. He walked casually in that direction, pretending to admire the artwork and architecture while keeping an eye on the soldier. The guard remained perfectly still with his rifle at his side and his gaze fixed on some invisible point in the distance. George had to admit he was impressed by the level of discipline and training these men must have received. As George positioned himself near the guard, he began to think about all the stories he had heard about people trying to break the composure of royal guards. Most attempts failed completely, with the guards showing no reaction whatsoever to even the most outrageous behavior. But George was not most people. He was a professional entertainer who had spent his entire career learning how to capture and hold people's attention. The charity gala was scheduled to begin in about 30 minutes, and guests were still arriving and mingling in the various palace rooms. George figured he had a little time to have some fun before the formal program started. He looked at the young guard one more time and made a decision that would lead to one of the most surprising and memorable encounters of his entire career. Walked up to a position about 6 feet away from the guard and pretended to be very interested in examining the marble pillar next to where the soldier stood. He moved slowly around the pillar, looking at it from different angles and occasionally glancing at the guard to see if there was any reaction. The guard remained completely motionless and gave no sign that he had even noticed George's presence. This was exactly the kind of challenge that George Clooney could never resist. He had built his entire career on his ability to connect with people and make them respond to his charm and humor. The idea that this young man could remain completely unaffected by his presence was both frustrating and intriguing. George's competitive spirit began to kick in, and he started planning his next move in what was about to become a very entertaining battle of wills. George decided to start his little experiment with something simple and innocent. He began walking back and forth in front of the young guard in a very casual way, as if he was just admiring the beautiful palace decorations. The guard remained perfectly still, with his eyes looking straight ahead and his face showing no expression at all. George was impressed by this level of self-control, but he was also determined to see if he could crack through that serious exterior. After a few minutes of casual walking, George decided to step up his game a little bit. He started making small gestures with his hands while he walked, pretending to point out interesting details on the walls and ceiling to an imaginary companion. He would stop suddenly and look up at the chandeliers with exaggerated surprise on his face, then shake his head and continue walking. The guard showed absolutely no reaction to any of these theatrical movements. George noticed that a few other guests were starting to glance in his direction with curious expressions on their faces. They probably wondered why the famous actor was spending so much time in this particular area of the palace, instead of mingling with the other celebrities and important people. George did not care about their curious looks because he was becoming more and more fascinated by this challenge. The young guard was really quite impressive in his discipline. His red uniform was perfectly pressed, and his tall black hat sat exactly straight on his head. His white gloves were spotless, and his black boots were polished to a mirror shine. Everything about his appearance was absolutely perfect, and his posture was as straight as a board. George had to admit that the training these guards received must be incredibly thorough and demanding. George decided to try a different approach. He walked up closer to the guard and began speaking to him in a conversational tone, as if they were old friends having a casual chat. He started by commenting on the beautiful weather outside and how lovely the palace looked in the evening light. The guard gave no sign that he heard anything George was saying. His eyes remained fixed on that invisible point in the distance, and his expression stayed completely blank. This lack of response only made George more determined to continue. He began telling the guard about his flight to London. He was to be attending such an important charity event. He described the view from his hotel room and mentioned some of the other celebrities he had seen arriving at the palace. George spoke in his most charming voice, using the same warm and friendly tone that had made him so popular with audiences around the world. Still, the guard showed no reaction at all. George was starting to understand why these royal guards had such an amazing reputation for their discipline and professionalism. This young man was clearly taking his duties very seriously and was not going to be distracted by anything, no matter how famous or charming the person trying to distract him might be. George looked around and noticed that more palace guests were beginning to pay attention to his unusual behavior. A small group of well-dressed women had stopped their conversation to watch what the Hollywood star was doing. A few men in expensive suits were also glancing over with amused expressions on their faces. George realized that he was starting to create quite a scene, but this only encouraged him to continue his mission. He decided to try telling the guards some jokes. George had always been known for his sense of humor and his ability to make people laugh even in the most serious situations. He started with some light-hearted observations about the differences between American and British culture. He talked about how Americans always seemed to be in a hurry, while the British were more polite and patient. The guard remained motionless and showed no sign of amusement. George moved on to some funny stories from his movie sets. He described mishaps that had happened during filming and shared amusing anecdotes about working with other famous actors. He told the guard about the time he had accidentally walked into the wrong trailer and surprised another actor who was taking a nap. He explained how they had both been so startled that they had started laughing uncontrollably and could not stop. For several minutes, the guard listened to all of these stories without moving a single muscle in his face. George was beginning to realize that this was going to be much more difficult than he had originally thought. This young man had clearly mastered the art of maintaining his composure under any circumstances. George found himself developing a genuine respect for the guard's professionalism and dedication to his duties. But George Clooney was not the type of person to give up easily. His competitive nature and his natural showmanship were now fully engaged. He began to think of this as a performance challenge rather than just a simple prank. He wanted to see if his years of experience as an entertainer could finally break through the guard's incredible self-control. George started doing some physical comedy routines. He pretended to trip over his own feet and then caught himself at the last second with an exaggerated flourish. He made funny faces and struck dramatic poses as if he was performing in a silent movie. He even attempted a few dance steps that he remembered from one of his films, where he had played a character who was supposed to be a terrible dancer. The small crowd of onlookers was growing larger, and George could hear some quiet chuckles and whispers from the people who were watching his impromptu performance. He was clearly entertaining the other palace guests, even if he was not getting any reaction from his primary target. The guard continued to stand like a statue, completely unmoved by all of George's antics. George paused for a moment to catch his breath and think about what to try next. He looked at the guard's face very carefully, trying to detect even the smallest sign of amusement or interest. The young man's eyes were still staring straight ahead, but George thought he might have noticed just the tiniest hint of something different in their expression. It was so subtle that he could not be sure if he was imagining it or not, but it gave him hope that his efforts were not completely wasted. The charity gala was scheduled to begin soon, and George knew that he would have to join the other guests in the main ballroom before long, but he was not ready to give up on this fascinating challenge just yet. He was determined to find some way to get a reaction from this incredibly disciplined young soldier. George decided it was time to bring out his biggest weapons in this battle of wills. He had been holding back some of his most entertaining material, but now he felt it was time to use everything he had learned during his years in Hollywood. The small crowd of palace guests who had gathered to watch his performance was growing bigger, and George could see that even some of the palace staff had stopped their work to see what the famous actor was doing. George began by doing his impression of a stuffy British aristocrat. He puffed out his chest and put on an exaggerated upper-class English accent that sounded like something from a comedy movie. He pretended to have a conversation with an imaginary butler about the weather and the state of his garden. He complained in this fake accent about how difficult it was to find good help these days and how the younger generation had no respect for tradition. The people watching George's performance began to giggle and whisper among themselves. His British accent was so over the top and ridiculous that it was impossible not to find it amusing. George played up to his audience by making his gestures even more dramatic and his accent even more exaggerated. He pretended to adjust an imaginary monocle and complained about his imaginary horse being too slow during his morning ride, but the young guard remained completely still and showed no reaction to George's theatrical performance. His face was like stone, and his eyes continued to stare straight ahead as if nothing unusual was happening right in front of him. George had to admit that he was genuinely impressed by this level of self-control. Most people would have at least smiled a little bit by now, but this guard was clearly made of stronger stuff. George decided to try a different approach. He began telling embarrassing stories about other famous actors and celebrities. He shared funny tales about mishaps that had happened at award shows and described awkward moments from movie premieres. He told the guard about the time a very famous actress had tripped while walking up the stairs to receive an award, and how she had handled the situation with grace and humor. George was careful not to be mean or cruel in his stories. He only shared tales that he knew the celebrities themselves would not mind him telling. His goal was to entertain, not to hurt anyone's reputation or feelings. He wanted to show the guard that Hollywood stars were just regular people who sometimes found themselves in funny situations, just like everyone else. The crowd around George was getting bigger and more engaged with his performance. Palace guests who had been walking by stopped to listen to his stories and jokes. Some of them were taking pictures with their phones, though they were trying to be discreet about it since photography was not officially allowed inside the palace. George noticed the cameras, but he did not mind because he was having too much fun to worry about it. George started doing impressions of some of his fellow actors. He mimicked the voice and mannerisms of several famous stars, doing exaggerated versions of their most well-known characters. He pretended to be a tough action hero delivering dramatic lines about saving the world. Then he switched to being a romantic leading man, declaring his love in the most over-the-top way possible. His impressions were spot on and had the crowd laughing out loud. Still, the guard showed absolutely no reaction. George was beginning to wonder if this young man was actually human or if he might be some kind of robot designed to look like a person. The level of discipline and self-control required to ignore such an entertaining performance was almost superhuman. George found himself developing even more respect for the guard's professionalism. George decided to try singing. He had never been known as a singer, but he had performed musical numbers in a few of his movies, and he had a decent voice when he put effort into it. He started with some popular songs that everyone would recognize, changing the lyrics to make them funny and relevant to the palace setting. He sang about royal guards and fancy parties and meeting kings and queens. The crowd was really enjoying George's musical performance. Some of them began clapping along with the rhythm, and a few brave souls even started singing along with the parts they knew. The atmosphere in that corner of the palace had become almost like a small concert with George as the main performer, and the royal guard as his unwitting co-star. George noticed that even some of the other royal guards who were stationed in nearby areas seemed to be paying attention to what was happening, though they were trying hard not to show it. Their eyes remained fixed straight ahead, but George thought he could detect small changes in their posture that suggested they were listening to his performance. This gave him hope that his target guard might also be more aware of what was happening. Then he was letting on. George began incorporating more physical comedy into his routine. He pretended to be different types of characters from his movies, using exaggerated body movements and facial expressions. He mimicked the way tough guys walked and talked in action films. He pretended to be a nervous romantic, trying to ask someone on a date. He even did his impression of a confused tourist, trying to figure out which way to go in a foreign country. The young guard remained perfectly still through all of this entertainment. His military training had clearly prepared him well for situations where he needed to ignore distractions and focus on his duties. George was running out of ideas, but he was not ready to give up yet. He felt like he was getting closer to cracking the guard's composure, even though there was no visible evidence to support this feeling. George paused his performance for a moment and looked directly at the guard's face. He studied every detail, trying to detect any small sign that his efforts were having some effect. The guard's expression remained completely neutral, but George thought he noticed something different about the way the young man was breathing. It was very subtle, but it seemed like he might be working a little harder to maintain his composure than he had been at the beginning of George's performance. This tiny observation gave George renewed energy and determination. He felt like he was finally starting to make some progress in his mission to get a reaction from this incredibly disciplined soldier. George felt a surge of excitement as he thought he was finally making some progress with the young guard. The subtle change in the soldier's breathing pattern gave him hope that all his efforts were not completely wasted. He decided to push even harder and pull out his most impressive entertainment skills. George had been saving his best material for last, and now seemed like the perfect time to use it. George began doing his most famous impressions of well-known politicians and world leaders. He had perfected these impressions over the years at private parties, and they were always crowd pleasers. He started with his impression of various American presidents, changing his voice and posture to match each one perfectly. He mimicked their speech patterns and hand gestures so accurately that the growing crowd around him burst into delighted laughter and applause. The palace guests were clearly having a wonderful time watching this unexpected entertainment. Word had spread throughout the palace that George Clooney was putting on an impromptu comedy show, and more people kept arriving to see what all the excitement was about. Palace staff members were trying to maintain their professional composure, but even they could not hide their amusement at the Hollywood star's antics. George noticed that some very important-looking people had joined the crowd, including what appeared to be government officials and perhaps even some members of the royal family's staff. This made him a bit nervous, but also excited because he realized he was performing for a truly distinguished audience. He decided to make his performance even more special by including some material that would be particularly appreciated by British viewers. George started doing impressions of famous British actors and comedians. He had studied their work carefully over the years and had a good ear for accents and speech patterns. His impression of a famous British comedian had the crowd roaring with laughter, and even some of the usually serious palace officials were smiling. George felt like he was really hitting his stride as a performer, but the young guard still showed no visible reaction to any of this entertainment. George was starting to wonder if anything could crack this soldier's incredible discipline. The guard's eyes remained fixed on that invisible point in the distance, and his face continued to show no expression at all. It was like he was completely deaf and blind to everything happening around him. George decided to try something different. He began telling stories about his own childhood and early career, sharing amusing anecdotes about his journey from a small-town boy to a Hollywood superstar. He talked about his first acting jobs and the embarrassing mistakes he had made when he was learning his craft. He described auditions that had gone terribly wrong and movie scenes that had required dozens of takes because he kept making silly errors. The crowd was fascinated by these behind-the-scenes glimpses into George's life and career. They listened intently as he shared stories they had never heard before about his struggles and triumphs in the entertainment industry. George was a natural storyteller, and he knew how to keep his audience engaged with vivid details and perfect timing. George told the guard about the time he had been so nervous during his first big movie audition that he had accidentally walked into the wrong room and started performing his lines for a group of confused janitors. He described how embarrassed he had been when he realized his mistake, but how the janitors had been so kind and encouraging that it had actually helped him calm down for his real audition. Still, the guard remained motionless, but George thought he detected something new in the young man's expression. It was incredibly subtle, but there seemed to be a tiny softening around his eyes, as if he was fighting to suppress some kind of reaction. George felt like he was getting closer to achieving his goal of making the guard break character. George decided to take a big risk and try his most outrageous material. He began doing a dramatic reenactment of scenes from some of his most famous movies, but with ridiculous comedic twists. He pretended to be his character from a serious dramatic film, but acted as if he was in a silly comedy instead. He used exaggerated facial expressions and over-the-top gestures that were completely inappropriate for the original scenes. The crowd was absolutely delighted by this performance. They recognized the movies George was referencing and found his comedic interpretations hilarious. Some people were laughing so hard they had tears in their eyes. Even the palace staff who were supposed to be working were finding it difficult to concentrate on their duties because they kept getting distracted by George's entertaining show. George noticed that photographers were now openly taking pictures of his performance. He realized that this whole event was probably going to end up in newspapers and magazines around the world. The thought of this made him both excited and slightly worried, but he was having too much fun to stop now. The young guard's lips seemed to twitch ever so slightly during one of George's most ridiculous dramatic interpretations. It was such a small movement that George almost missed it, but he was watching the guard's face so carefully that he caught the tiny change. This was the first real sign that the guard was actually listening and responding to the entertainment, even if he was trying very hard not to show it. George felt a rush of victory and determination. He knew he was finally getting through to the guard and making some progress in his mission. The subtle lip twitch was like a crack in a dam, and George sensed that if he kept pushing, he might be able to cause a much bigger reaction. George decided to go all out with his next performance. He began doing an elaborate reenactment of a famous movie scene, but he added his own special touches to make it as funny and entertaining as possible. He used every trick he had learned during his years as an actor and entertainer, putting all of his energy and creativity into this one spectacular performance. The crowd was completely captivated by George's show. They watched in amazement as the famous actor gave everything he had to entertain them and try to crack the composure of one young royal guard. George felt like he was giving the performance of his lifetime, and he could sense that something big was about to happen. George saw that tiny lip twitch and felt like he had just won the lottery. After all his efforts and elaborate performances, he was finally seeing a crack in the guard's incredible composure. The young soldier was clearly fighting an internal battle between his professional training and his natural human reaction to the entertainment happening right in front of him. George knew this was his moment to deliver the knockout punch that would finally break through the guard's discipline. George decided to launch into his most ridiculous celebrity impression yet. He began doing an over-the-top imitation of himself. From one of his most famous romantic comedy movies, he exaggerated all of his own mannerisms and speech patterns, making himself look completely silly and self-important. He pretended to be giving a dramatic love speech to an imaginary leading lady using the cheesiest lines and most theatrical gestures he could think of. The crowd around George was absolutely loving this performance. They had never seen a major Hollywood star make such fun of himself in such a public way. George was not holding anything back and was willing to look completely ridiculous. If it meant getting a reaction from the young guard, his self-deprecating humor and willingness to be the joke rather than just tell jokes made his performance even more endearing to the audience. George noticed that the guard's eyes seemed to be sparkling with suppressed laughter, even though the rest of his face remained perfectly serious. The young man was clearly struggling to maintain his composure, and George could sense that he was very close to achieving his goal. The guard's breathing had become slightly more irregular, and there were tiny muscle movements around his mouth that suggested he was working very hard to keep from smiling. George decided to go for broke with his final assault on the guard's self-control. He began doing his most outrageous impression, combining elements from several different characters and celebrities all rolled into one ridiculous performance. He mixed his British aristocrat voice with his politician gestures and added some of his romantic leading man poses for good measure. The result was absolutely hilarious and completely absurd. Just when George thought he might finally see the guard crack into laughter, something completely unexpected happened. Instead of breaking into giggles or losing his composure the way everyone expected the young guard did, something that shocked every single person watching. Without moving his body or changing his rigid posture, the guard suddenly began to speak in a perfect American accent that sounded exactly like George Clooney himself. The crowd gasped in complete surprise and amazement as the guard started doing a flawless impression of George. His voice captured every nuance of George's speaking pattern, from his slight Kentucky drawl to his characteristic pauses and inflections. The guard began reciting lines from some of George's most famous movies, but he delivered them with his own comedic timing and added little touches that made them even funnier than the originals. George stood there with his mouth hanging open, unable to believe what was happening. The guard was not just doing a good impression, he was doing an absolutely perfect impression that captured not only George's voice, but also his mannerisms and personality. The young soldier had clearly studied George's work very carefully, and had been practicing this impression for a long time, waiting for the perfect opportunity to use it. The guard continued his performance while maintaining his rigid military posture. He never moved his body or changed his facial expression, but his voice kept delivering perfect George Clooney impressions that had the entire crowd laughing and applauding. He recited dialogue from George's romantic comedies, but delivered it as if he was doing a parody of the original performances. The crowd was going absolutely wild with excitement and laughter. They had come to the palace expecting a formal charity gala, but instead they were getting the most unexpected and entertaining show of their lives. People were taking pictures and videos with their phones, trying to capture this incredible moment that they knew they would never see anything like again. George felt a mixture of amazement, admiration, and good-natured defeat. He had been completely outmaneuvered by this young guard who had turned the tables on him in the most spectacular way possible. Instead of being the entertainer, George had become the entertained, and he was loving every minute of it. The guard's impression was so good that George almost felt like he was watching himself perform. The guard began incorporating some of the jokes and stories that George had told during his own performance, but he twisted them around and delivered them as if George himself was telling them about someone else. It was incredibly clever and showed that the young man had not only been listening to everything George said, but had also been thinking of ways to use that material in his own performance. Palace officials who had initially looked concerned about the disruption were now smiling and enjoying the show. Even the other royal guards who were stationed nearby seemed to be fighting to suppress their own amusement at their colleague's incredible performance. The entire atmosphere in that section of the palace had become festive and joyful thanks to this unexpected entertainment. The guard's impression was so convincing that for a moment George wondered if he was having some kind of strange dream or hallucination. It seemed impossible that this young soldier could sound so exactly like him while maintaining perfect military posture and discipline. The guard had managed to be both completely professional and completely entertaining at the same time. George began to realize that this was not just a random talent or lucky accident. The guard's performance was too polished and too perfect to be improvised on the spot. This young man had clearly been preparing for this moment and had probably been hoping for months, or even years, that he would get a chance to meet George Clooney and show off his incredible impression skills. The crowd continued to cheer and applaud as the guard seamlessly transitioned between different George Clooney characters and movies. He did romantic leading man George, then switched to serious dramatic actor George and finished with comedy star George. Each impression was flawless and showed that the guard had studied George's entire career and understood all the different aspects of his acting abilities. George felt completely humbled and impressed by this unexpected turn of events. He had come to the palace thinking he would entertain others, but instead he had discovered an incredibly talented performer who had completely stolen the show and given everyone an experience they would never forget. The guard's incredible performance continued for several more minutes, with each impression getting better and more detailed than the last. George watched in complete fascination as this young soldier demonstrated a level of talent that would have been impressive, even by Hollywood standards. The guard had clearly spent countless hours studying George's movies and interviews to perfect his impression to such an amazing degree. When the performance finally ended, the guard smoothly transitioned back to his rigid military posture as if nothing unusual had happened at all. His face returned to its completely neutral expression, and his eyes went back to staring at that invisible point in the distance. The only sign that anything had occurred was the slight twinkle of amusement that remained in his eyes and the barely visible hint of a smile that played at the corners of his mouth. The crowd erupted in thunderous applause and cheers that echoed through the palace corridors. People were clapping so enthusiastically that the sound could probably be heard in other parts of the building. George joined in the applause wholeheartedly, feeling genuinely amazed and entertained by what he had just witnessed. He had never expected to be so completely upstaged by someone else, especially not by a royal guard, who was supposed to be completely silent and motionless. George walked closer to the guard and spoke in a voice that was loud enough for the young man to hear, but quiet enough to be somewhat private. He said that the performance had been absolutely brilliant and that he had been completely impressed by the guard's talent and preparation. The guard remained in his official position, but George could see that he was listening carefully to every word. The guard whispered back in his normal voice, which had a pleasant British accent that was completely different from the perfect American accent he had used during his George Clooney impression. He thanked George for the compliment and admitted that he had been practicing that impression for many months, hoping that someday he might get a chance to meet the famous actor and show off his skills. George laughed and told the guard that he had definitely succeeded in his goal and had given everyone an incredible surprise. He asked the guard what his name was and learned that the young man was called James and that he had been working as a royal guard for about 2 years. James explained that he had always been interested in acting and comedy, but had decided to serve his country first before pursuing any other career goals. The crowd around them was still buzzing with excitement, and many people were approaching George to congratulate him on providing such wonderful entertainment. However, George made sure to redirect their praise to James and explained that the young guard was the real star of the show. He told everyone that James had completely turned the tables on him and had given the most impressive performance he had seen in years. Word of the incredible encounter was spreading rapidly throughout the palace. Guests who had missed the original performance were hearing about it from others and were disappointed that they had not been there to witness it themselves. Palace staff members were talking excitedly about what had happened, and some of them were already planning to share the story with their friends and families when they got home. George spent the next few minutes talking quietly with James. Whenever the guard could respond without compromising his official duties, George learned that James had grown up watching George's movies and had always admired his work, both as an actor and as a humanitarian. James explained that he had studied George's performances very carefully, not just for entertainment, but because he genuinely respected George's talent and wanted to understand what made him such a successful performer. George was touched by James's admiration and told him that he was clearly very talented and should seriously consider pursuing acting or comedy as a career when his military service was complete. He offered to give James some advice about the entertainment industry and even suggested that James should consider auditioning for some British television shows or theater productions as the time for the charity gala to officially begin approached. George realized that he needed to join the other guests in the main ballroom. He thanked James one more time for the incredible experience and promised that he would never forget this amazing encounter. James remained in his professional position, but George could see the genuine appreciation and happiness in the young man's eyes. George made his way toward the ballroom, but found himself constantly stopped by other guests, who wanted to talk about what they had just witnessed. Everyone was amazed by both George's entertaining performance and James's incredible surprise response. Many people said it was the most memorable and enjoyable experience they had ever had at a formal royal event. During the charity gala, George found himself telling the story of his encounter with James to everyone he met. He described how the young guard had completely surprised him and had demonstrated such impressive talent and preparation. George made sure to emphasize that James was the real hero of the story and that the guard's performance had been far more impressive than anything George himself had done. The story of George Clooney and the Royal Guard quickly became the talk of the entire event. Guests were sharing the tale with each other, and many people were expressing hope that they might get a chance to meet James themselves before the evening was over. The encounter had transformed what could have been just another formal charity dinner into an unforgettable and magical experience for everyone who attended. George spent the rest of the evening feeling grateful for the unexpected surprise and impressed by the reminder that talent and creativity could be found in the most unlikely places. His playful attempt to entertain a royal guard had turned into one of the most memorable and enjoyable experiences of his entire career and had introduced him to a remarkably gifted young man who had given him a performance he would treasure forever.